We're now live on YouTube with the April 22nd meeting of the Node.js modules team. We don't have the whole team here, but we've got some of us. We have a somewhat light agenda today, but I think it's worth digging into what we have. I guess we could start with announcements, and I would love to announce that yesterday, with the release of Node.js 14, we removed the warning for ESM in Node. The warning still exists on 13. I don't think we're looking to backport the removing of the warning to 13. 12 continues to have the warning as well as the flag. In fact, there are a couple additional warnings on 12, although Michael Zasso, who's on the call right now, backported the removal of some of those other warnings yesterday, which will likely and hopefully come out on, I guess it's 12.16.3. Does anybody else have other announcements? Okay, in lieu of any announcements, we can get right into the agenda. I'll remind folks to please add their names to the docs in case it isn't there, including your GitHub handles, because sometimes it's nice to have. The first issue on the agenda right now is development and production export conditions. Does anybody want to introduce this topic? Bueller? I don't mean this in a mean way, but if we're not fighting to introduce the topic, I have a distinct feeling we're not going to be fighting to talk about it.
I mean, I can talk about what I think it's about, but like, it's not my PR.
Yeah, I know the high level of it, and can introduce it, but essentially, there were some discussions in different communities, and I believe it was specifically the React community that inspired this, which was the idea of creating some new conditions within conditional exports, and these conditions would allow to break, in this PR specifically, on either development or production in the node-env environment if it were set. There is a lot of discussion in here, and in fact some explicit -1s. Those -1s are less about conditional exports, but more about Node traditionally has not relied on behavior of node-env for how Node itself works. And there's a number of TSC members who are not super enthusiastic about introducing a reliance on that or creating any sort of behavior based on that, especially since those environment variables don't have clear defaults and different libraries utilize them differently. So there is some active discussion around things that could change, that could get people on board. They include potentially changing a mental model here. So one conversation I had with like Mateo, who's one of the people who blocked, was that if we move to a different environment variable, not node-env, which kind of has history behind it, but one that's fresh, that would relieve part of the block. And I actually think that there's, to an extent, some kind of like historical precedent that we have for doing things like this, like with type module, instead of just using the module entry point. Like we chose not to use pre-existing patterns from the ecosystem, but rather carve out a new one, even if it did require extra work for people. The other one that we talked about was, right now this is based on the concept of kind of development versus production, which people don't have necessarily consensus around. I think that there was clear interest in the pull request across multiple people of introducing like a debug mode to Node. So something that has maybe a little bit more to do with like log levels. But I think that that's still something that's being debated. Jordan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, it feels like conceptually, I think this is just wrong, that resolution should not be affected by the environment. Like clearly there's use cases for having a different production and development build, and clearly there's use cases for having debugging on or off in any environment. But like conditional exports is about which implementation do I want, and production versus development is usually about, and this is true for React as well, it's either about what Babel settings am I using, or like what's my target outputs, but then it's also about am I going to delete some code or include it. It's not like in other words, production and development React have never been a different implementation. They're identical. It's just that there's some code, specifically some warning code. Maybe they're not identical. They seem identical. They're observably identical, but there's some warning code deleted in the production version. And like that, it just doesn't feel appropriate to me that should be kind of mushed into conditional exports there. Like I can understand platform node versus browser, but like not, yeah, I don't think environment is the proper thing to, or I don't think this is the proper place for environment switching.
Bradley?
So in the case of React, they aren't changing the names or API signatures of what's exported, but they do actually have side effects that occur only in the development and debugging environments. Particularly, they hook into various kinds of dev tools and extensions. So they actually do like run side effects when they're in this development mode, even if their import wouldn't be used any differently. They do have effects that they never want to see in a production build.
Well, some people do, and they then run the development build in production. It's just that the React team has decided for the ecosystem that they don't think anyone should use these things in the production build.
No, you should literally never, ever, under any circumstance, do it, because all it does is hook into dev tools.
Right, and developers often need dev tools in production to develop things. You don't have to agree that it's appropriate, but like that is a use case that has happened.
Overrides, you can use different,
and that is the current way it's done, is that in their bundler they configure it when they need it to use the development version of React instead of the production version.
That is not how we do it. We do a network override, which is super crappy. I'm not saying it's impossible to do these things. I'm stating that although you're trying to state that there is no benefit to this, there is an obvious reason.
No, I'm not saying there's no benefit.
The idea of having the environment affect the code itself is beneficial, is what I'm saying. The idea that the environment should not affect your code does not appear to be true.
Right. I'm talking specifically about resolution, not about affecting the code. People pivot their code around Node.js and things like that all the time.
But the current way in which we do stuff, the resolution is how you determine what code is loaded.
So if we step back for a second, I think that there's some premises here that this PR is built upon that maybe we need to build some consensus around. So like independent of the use case, which I think is independent, like one thing that came up, for example, with Matteo when he was talking about debuggability was the ability for this to be dynamic in the lifetime of an application. I don't think that we're going to get through like debating the validity of that or not in this call today, especially since we don't have everyone on the call. But I pointed out for the reason of saying, like, I think that there's a handful of kind of like core things we need to get on the same page about before we can even start exploring the feature itself. One would be like, are conditional exports something that like are set in stone at launch, or is it something that can change based on like something like if you set process env node, if you set the node env somewhere in the life cycle of the app, should later imports that haven't actually happened yet or requires that happen later after that execution now have access to the debug version if nothing's in the cache yet? If it's already in the cache, what should we do there? Like, I think that there's like high level discussion have there. The other would be whether or not we want the conditions themselves to be static, or if we want to be able to have like some sort of statement in the condition. So for example, in the case of like the node-end production bit here, like that is a very, very specific thing. But if we allowed for conditions on the left-hand side, so something like process node-env equals production, I don't think we should do that personally right now, but it's just like at what layer of abstraction we should be offering this to developers, I think is important as well. Brad?
So we actually have a lot of different flags for how different parts of module loading work right now. Some are for symlinks, some are for resolution, old node underscore path, things like that. The home directory in CommonJS, all these things are set when node starts up currently. I don't think we should vary this feature to be the one feature that is dynamic, especially given, I put a comment in the thread. Most of the use cases, including bundling technologies and stuff like that, do it only at startup, and then they cache values or they delete things permanently and stuff of that nature. If you expect this value to be dynamically altered and respected, that's not the case for anything to my knowledge in the ecosystem, including the existing flags we have for modules. So I really don't think this should alter things at runtime, unless we want to discuss all the other things that don't alter runtime.
Yeah, Brad, I think you and I likely feel very similar there. Like introducing dynamicism into this, or runtime dynamicism, kind of like unravels a whole bunch of the design goals that we had when we put it together.
And potentially reopens a lot of topics that we've otherwise closed.
Wait, can you move? Can you move to the right a little bit so that Corey, you have your hand up?
Yes. So one concern I kind of have about this is once people start if people were to start publishing packages that have conditional exports on, say, development, then that could be surprising to somebody that just wants to use it on their own package. One thought I had is if this were modeled more like node debug, like for example, node devil equals my package, or node devil equals some other package that I want to enable development mode on. I'm not sure if that's been considered. I do kind of agree with the idea that using node-m for this is, I'm not sure that would be a great idea. Anyways, what do people think?
So just to restate this, you're saying that instead of having this applied to the entire application, you want to be able to apply it to specific packages only and not have a global flag.
Yes, so essentially an opt-in to development mode of package X, Y, and Z. And essentially using the same syntax as the node debug environment would use.
Well, I think we might get into issues there because we can have multiple packages with the same names. So something like node underscore debug, the environment variable as it stands today, is probably not going to work out, especially if you have things. We were just on a call, well, NPM just had its RFC call where they were talking about overrides and the potential for having multiple packages with the same name being overwritten in different locations of your install. Per the actual thing about opting in per package. I think we have a well-established definition of package boundaries now, so it's possible we could do that. I don't know if having things done on a per package level is realistic, because things like if React suddenly in its new installation includes a submodule that also should have the development build uh, referenced, but you would start to need to know the internal package structure of your entire application, and having to set flags for each of the internal packages seems strange to me.
So one thing that was brought up in the thread by Gus, which I don't think we should preclude. I know this is not necessarily the solution that everyone wants, but there is something to be said that this is something that loaders could also help out with, especially if the ecosystem aligns around like pattern or tooling that is on top of Node, but not explicitly Node. If people ran like a debug loader when they wanted to debug, and that debug loader had the information that it needed to know, there's no reason, for example, that these kinds of like production versus debug versus like whatever flags people want to put in conditions, you know, are things that we do support, because we do support putting in whatever flag you want. We'll just ignore it if our loader doesn't know about it, and something like, you know, default or none flags will just work. So I think that there is you know, very much design space here for this to be solved in the ecosystem as well. Although, you know, like many other things, the solution will likely have better adoption and consistency if it's something that is supported by core. But I do think it's worth mentioning that I think we have given people the majority of tools needed to implement something like this themselves. Yep, Brad?
I agree that loaders are a power tool which we can shove everything under pretty much. I'm not clear on exactly why we should use loaders for everything. Just because loaders are capable of doing things doesn't mean everything should be a loader. Loaders are a way of basically overriding default behaviors and default configuration even. So we do have flags that affect things like particularly the symlink flags, where if you set symlink flags, you do affect the default loader. We don't require people to create their own loader to respect symlinks in the way they want. We let that be configurable. Same for the resolution algorithm. I think it really comes down to, is this a configurable part of our loader, or is it something we don't want to be configurable as our loader, but we want to allow the ecosystem to do on their own? For me personally, I don't see why there's much to discuss about configuring the conditions that we may want to have in our loader. I think for resolution, there's much more things we could talk about. This is basically a bit field where you turn things on and off by name. So if we can't configure that, we should probably figure out what is wrong with the designs of conditions that configuring them is controversial.
So I don't think you had joined yet, Brad, but I think the reason why this particular condition is controversial is because we don't want the reliance on Node.env, and the distinction between production and development is not consistent throughout the ecosystem.
So I'm not stating that we have to do it the same as this PR, but it doesn't seem clear to me why this is something we don't want to be configurable. Usually I would consider things we don't want to be configurable are things that could cause, security problems if misconfigured, and they could do other things. But when you're going down to the loader level, that's much more dangerous and harder to get people to properly configure a loader than, say, a command line flag or an environment variable. Like even the way we expose the conditions in our loaders, we have some like object identity stuff going on for the conditions. And I don't know if people are going to do wacky stuff with that. They could, but it just seems weird to me that we're trying to shove this under loaders. There doesn't seem a clear reason why this configuring this is seen as problematic. The way in which it's configured, Node env, seems, I guess, problematic because of collisions or misuse. But if we solve that, I don't see the clear objection.
So I think back to the point that Matteo was bringing about wanting it to be dynamic. I think that at least my gut on this is not that it is so controversial, but it's more about, one would be the framing of what these conditions mean. I think that people are not super thrilled about production versus development, as opposed to like, regular versus debug. I think that like a log level one is maybe a little different, but I'm not sure that that's 100% the case. And the other is like dynamic versus not dynamic. Wes comments, and Wes, would you like me to read that for you? Wes says that he doesn't think it's a good idea because he doesn't think presenting a conditionally different API is a good idea, period, dev or prod or no, but he's kept mostly quiet on the thread. Like you all know, prod versus dev conditional flag is going to make packages with make use of it much harder to statically analyze. Brad?
So tools in the ecosystem already have to deal with the evil of process env, even if they're not running in Node, unfortunately. Most tooling, even tooling that is not specifically targeting Node, bundlers for the web, stuff like that, support process env just because it is the standard way in which people are configuring different values for that. And they do some kinds of code elimination, they do constant substitution, things like that. I agree it makes it harder to analyze, but it would be significantly easier to analyze the package JSON than to parse out the JavaScript to find those variables and property accesses as currently exists.
So it seems to me like we've spent most of the meeting on this one topic so far. It seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that kind of the next steps that need to be done here are likely to further scope, kind of like there's high level feature asks here, but there's kind of like low level assumptions. So we probably need to work out some of those, as well as further define the feature to move things forward. It kind of feels like perhaps we're not going to get too much more done during this call. Does anyone have any objections to tabling this agenda item for now and moving on to the next one?
I'd probably make a stronger sense that we just simply don't have a direction on this item. Like there's not a clear path forward to me because
Okay.
there's not a clear direct reasoning on either side to push it in either way.
That's fair. I mean, to me, it was more that like this is a feature request that's come from the ecosystem to us to a certain extent. So trying to find some sort of path towards consensus, or I feel like either we need to define a path to consensus or we need to like close it. Otherwise, we're not really doing anyone a service by having ongoing discussion. So I guess maybe the question to you, Brad, would be, are you saying that it's not clear as in like way more discussion needs to happen to figure out if it's clear, or it's like it's not clear and we should probably just close it out?
I think that currently discussion doesn't seem to have direction. We probably shouldn't close it out, but we don't have any real way of crossing the different aisles that we've established of wanting dynamic not versus static, or wanting this to even exist at all versus status quo of ways people are doing this already. So I think we could just put it on some level of blocked, but not blocked on code, blocked on use case constraints not being clear.
Okay. Anyone else have anything to add before we move to the next agenda item? Okay, the next one we have up is number 32838, empty fallback and null exports as not exported. My understanding, looking at this quickly, it's a pull request from Guy, and I think it just limits specifically throwing errors when you pass an empty array or null on the right-hand side of exports. Currently, I think they're allowed, but they just don't do anything. So disallowing them would throw earlier errors. Do people have any particular thoughts or feelings about this?
Just do it. Sounds fine.
Okay, I'm adding that in a comment and removing the modules agenda. My guess was Guy was attempting to just, make sure people were aware of larger changes before they came. Okay, so the next one, ESM, allow configuring default package type. Brad, this is yours. Do you want to introduce it?
Sure. So this is a build option for people who want to make custom builds of Node. A bunch of people in various issue threads on the social medias and whatever have stated they want to change the default package type either currently what Node is shipping or sometime in the future what Node can ship in the future. So I made a PR that would let them do a custom build of Node for this. The caveat here is virtually nothing runs if you set that flag. You can run some little toy applications with it, but very few things actually run with it. So this is more to let them have a playground to work with stuff. I firmly believe we should not make this a runtime configurable thing right now, because people will start relying on it in various shell scripts, and it would be very bad when using child process in particular. If they fire up a child process with the wrong node, it would default to the wrong package type, which could have bad effects. So that's it. Wes is stating you can simulate the environment like this with a fork of npm yarn that it edits installed package files. To some extent, that's true. That's for things with package JSONs. There's also like some minor caveats here that the way in which the node CLI determines if its entry point is common JS or a ESM module is affected in a non-trivial way by changing the package type. Because there's this function, I think it should load as ESM. If you look at the PR, it had to be modified because the changing of the default is a little bit weird there. But yeah, this is just a way if people want to build that node version that they keep talking about, they can go test it. They don't really need to go through us, or they can, use it without opening issues.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we were debating there, although I haven't followed up on where we landed, was whether or not we wanted it to create the same binary name. And I had requested that perhaps we make it like Node-ESM or just like something that was explicitly a different binary name, just making things a little bit more explicit. But not a hill I care to die on, just a thought. Jordan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I guess I'm not clear on why this needs to be made easier. Like people who are building Node can just edit a string and make the default package type be something else and build it. And just float that patch on top of things.
I think it's to shut down debate, honestly. Like people are like, oh, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? And it's like, okay, well, like here's a really easy way to do it. And you could test it out and give us feedback.
But my answer is because I don't want it to be easy to do this. Like you're not supposed to be doing this. So like it shouldn't be made easier. Like if it's
not easy to do it, to my knowledge. Very few people build Node.
Right. No, but that's what I'm saying. So you're making something easier for a small audience that is already like, and I haven't tried to do it, but isn't it already just a matter of changing a string in one or two places and building it?
Not
like
exactly.
I don't know, like is your PR what someone would have to do themselves?
Yes.
Or is that just what's necessary to make it configurable? Because those are two different things.
So there's a minor indirection just for configurability where we load it as a variable instead of a hard-coded string in a few places. But there is some logic here too, because the default, we do some defaulting basically if the package type doesn't exist in multiple places. And so, like I said, there's like should load as ESM. There is when you're getting packaged metadata out.
I don't think it would be controversial to put up a PR that just had some refactors to make there be single sources of truth for things. That's something I'm always in favor of, even on, and this isn't a really, like I'm not a Node collaborator and I don't have to deal with it, but like conceptually, that's a good thing, right? But like, as Wes pointed out, people can already do this just by now. You can close your PR and they can just float that PR on top of Node. And if the parts that did the single source of truth refactoring were upstreamed, then your PR would end up being even smaller. So like, I guess I question the utility of landing it.
I mean, people are asking for it.
Sure, people ask for all sorts of things, but like,
but we don't really have
that doesn't mean we have to give it to them.
we don't have to give it to them, but I made a PR to give it to them. And so the counter to this is, why should we prevent them from having this thing?
For the same reason that we chose a single default, like because it causes ecosystem issues if it spreads, and it should be hard to do things that can cause bad, like ecosystem problems.
I don't think it's easy to configure and then build Node.
Right, but I mean, we're all talking relative terms, but I'm saying that, like, yeah, and as Wes is pointing out in chat, it's like it's dead code. It's never going to be unflagged or used in the future. It's, you know, potentially even untested, and like the PR exists, so they can now float that patch whether you land it or not. But like, I think the other thing is it shouldn't be made any easier, even if it's already really hard. It shouldn't, like 100 hard to 99 hard. Like it still shouldn't be made easier. It's not a thing we want to exist. That's my understanding anyway.
I mean, I want to give people what they want in general.
I want to give
long as
people
it
what they
doesn't
need, and
invalidate.
what they want is not always the same thing.
I don't think they need to not be able to do this, because like I said, you can do this PR. I did it. You're
Yeah, you're
stating
right.
we can make a recommendation for them to float this PR if they want to do it.
Mhm.
I
I think that's
seems
what I'm suggesting
fine.
is you've made this PR to show that it can be done, and now you could close the PR. And if there's anyone who wants to create debate, you can just say, hey, go float that PR, go nuts. Bye.
That sounds like a pretty FU kind of response to them when we could just merge it.
I think one thing worth considering on this too, Jordan, is that like, and I'm not actually, this is reasonable to ask Brad, but like, if we just put it as like a patch that people can float, that can A, go out of date, and B, is not tested. So, and I see this is actually kind of similar to what Wes was saying, but if we have a test, at least somewhere that can like run the configure, yeah. I don't know, Wes, if we would want to maintain something like that long term. And the fact that it would be a build time configuration flag would essentially require us having like a whole additional compilation just to test this. So as in thinking out loud, I think there is something valid around like if we can't have it tested, it is a risk keeping it in the source tree. Corey, you have your hand up?
Yes. So just to start with, I don't have any major objection to a build time flag. If it were a runtime flag, I would have an objection, which is basically that I don't want to get any PRs from people, you know, asking or demanding that I add, you know, type CommonJS to every package. You know, so I don't think the risk of that is high for a build time option, but if it were able to be set runtime, I could see people pushing bugs for that.
Corey, I guess one thing worth mentioning, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we already support type CommonJS. And just the fact that it is either CommonJS or module and it's CommonJS by default is an internal setting, which in the future could change.
There is some nuance there, but yes. We should probably introduce this if we're ever going to swap the default eventually.
Is it even clear that that's something that will ever get consensus, or that we'd ever want to do enough to override consensus or override the lack of?
I don't know.
It's not something I'm ever interested in doing, and I'm also pretty confident it won't ever be practical, because the CommonJS is going to be a large part of the ecosystem for effectively ever, you know, at least long enough that we probably all won't be here when we're having this discussion about changing the default.
So I think Wes did have actually like a pretty reasonable comment in here that like maybe we shouldn't consider introducing this kind of feature unless we have some sort of actual timeline, even if it's like a 6, 8, or 10 version timeline. But yeah, like thinking about it, I don't know how, like, I mean, I think back to just when we tried to change the buffer API how hard that was. I don't know how we could ever change the default of .js to be ESM, but that may just be, I'm not trying to bring stop energy here.
No, I'm fine with either direction, actually, this goes. So this is useful. I'm wondering if we can get consensus that we will never try to change the default, because that would also be a useful outcome here. Because it would also kind of do the same effect that I was trying to do with this PR. It would give a kind of source of truth to these people asking to change the default. So yeah, if we can eventually form a decision that we don't think we should change the default, I think that would be reasonable to close this PR.
Feels like quite a big thing to commit to, at
Um,
least on the fly.
I'm not saying we have to do it this meeting, but
I would feel comfortable to committing to the fact that we are like Node 14, for example, was just released and has 3 years of a life cycle. And we're absolutely like not going to be changing that in the next 3 years. I don't see how it could happen in the next 5 years. And now when you start kind of thinking about how that creeps, I am pretty close to saying that I don't know how we could, or I'll frame it a different way. I don't see how we could change the default without making large enough language changes in which the type field itself might be deprecated. I think that's maybe a better way to frame it. So I think that we might be able to find ourselves in a world where JS means ESM. But I think it would likely also be a world where we're not using type anymore. I think we're more likely to deprecate type than to deprecate out of the box JS supporting CJS. Would anyone disagree with that statement?
Seems reasonable.
And so I think if we have consensus around that, then this feature, which is essentially a bit flip for type, maybe doesn't really need to exist then, because the odds are we would not be using type if we had a mechanism to allow this to work. I'm not saying it would be the mechanism. So before some people get upset, but I look at something like module attributes as potentially a way in which we could be explicit about this and allow overrides. Again, not saying this is what or how it should be used, but like a fundamental change to the language seems more likely to for those who maybe can't see it, Jordan switched to the oh no. But yeah, just a thought process.
so to me, just like you said, because 14 defaults to JS being common JS for 3 years, that means likely all LTS in that 3-year time range will support .js as being common JS. And for all those years that those LTS are supported, it seems like this is a no-go to change just by nature, even if it's a hard truth to swallow. It seems that we have some feeling that this PR should never exist because we can never change the default to our knowledge of type, package type, to be clear.
That is my position.
I think that's fine. I can comment to that effect and close it out. Wes is saying if we can never change the default, we acknowledge CJS is first class forever. It is de facto, says Jordan. So ESM only features should be few. Says
In other
West.
words, we should try to strongly avoid introducing any feature that's just to ESM. Anything we add to one of the module systems, we should add to both, like as a
So-
general rule, obviously with exceptions.
Top level await then starts to become a very interesting challenge if
Yeah,
we ever
sure.
wanted to
And
introduce it.
absolutely, and that is true. But it's also, since it's tightly tied into the nature of the module system, that would also be a reasonable thing to argue as an exception. And I think that that's
Yeah.
a discussion we should have and should
Yeah,
have around every feature that isn't in both.
Yeah, and I guess that's like a good reason for like import meta also as an example, or like the equivalence not being on the other side. We
Mhm.
could explore looking at allowing top level await inside of common JS, but both Brad and I have done experiments that seem to imply it breaks the world, which sometimes is fun.
So I'm not sure I agree with this means that CJS is first class forever. We could eventually introduce a flag to disable the CJS loader, for example, just as we could introduce a flag to disable the ESM loader.
But those flags wouldn't mean that other features could be added just for one or the other. Like the fact that you can opt into disabling one of them until such time as that disabling is default, I don't think we would be able to justify, like for most cases, shipping a feature in one module system but not the other.
Maybe. I'm not clear on that one, but that's a case by case thing. That's very hard for me to make any judge on.
That's fair.
This feels like we've made a bit of a leap here from saying we can't switch the default to then saying that therefore CJS is first class forever.
I'd agree with that, Rob. I think I feel very strongly that CJS doesn't necessarily have to be first class forever. But I do think the default has to stay, even if CJS is not the preferred method in the future. Anyway, it seems like we can close that PR and we can state that we have no intent to change the defaults in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think even the folks who are uncomfortable committing to never changing the defaults, I feel like they'd have to agree that in the near to medium term, in like years, let's say, that there's no plan to change the defaults.
So we've got 4 minutes left. Is there any pressing stuff that people would like to talk about with the remainder of our time?
I wanted to add one quick note. With self exports, we ended up settling on the name and then kind of left a sigil as an open thing. It came up today in IRC that like it really sucks if you fork a package that's using self exports, because then you have to rename it throughout the code. Whereas if we had an additional form of self reference that was independent of the package name, then that problem is solved. I remember all of the, discussion around at versus tilde and all that stuff. But like, I just want to clarify, if we're able to come up with some sigil or specifically some way that to self-reference that is independent of the package name, I want to confirm that that's something that we could consider adding as a Semper Minor, potentially. Assuming we all got consensus, both here and upstream.
I think the discussions already went over a bunch of the issues about this. So as long as
yeah, and I'm not trying to rehash those now, just kind of saying, like, clarifying that as long as we can, the door isn't closed on that option, and we just have to address those issues.
that sounds okay here.
Cool.
I do have a issue as well. We have an older PR of mine that I need to rebase to move loaders into worker threads. We didn't have any objections. I didn't want it to land in 14 when it first went out because it disables one of the loader hooks. So I'm going to try to land that now that 14 is out. And we should probably not backport it if we can avoid it. Unfortunately, that means that 15, whenever it comes out, would have a different loader API because one of the hooks would cease to exist. The dynamic instantiate hook that we talked about a long while ago, multiple times. Is there any objections? There are no objections on the PR currently, but are there any objections for us moving forward with 15 in that break? In particular, we did have an objection about breaking that specific API, which is why we had to introduce a separate hook for instrumenting the global code. Wes was saying that we knew there'd be breaking changes to the loader API. That's why it's still experimental. I would feel more comfortable if we landed it in a non-LTS branch for people to play with than in the LTS branch itself. I guess it's stable right now, not LTS yet.
With that, I think we're at time. Brad, do you want to add Node.js modules in that issue that you were mentioning? And Corey, it looks like you have your hand up if you want to add one more thing.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention as far as not moving loaders into the separate thread in version 14, that would also mean that version 14 could never have non-experimental loaders. In my view, if the intent is to move them to a thread, then the only way we'd be able to backport unflagging the experimental status would be to backport the move to the separate thread.
We could try. I know most existing loaders, not most existing, a variety of existing loaders do use that hook, and having it work on LTS seemed more prudent than breaking it. If we do want to backport it and we're okay with making that breaking change, I think we can discuss it, but we haven't really got field testing of the worker thread loaders. So I don't really want to break people until we get more testing under the hood, at which point we could backport it. Basically, even though the API is experimental, we don't want to break things on the stable branch for 14 unless it feels like it's something that's going to move forward without a ton of breakage from my perspective.
With that, we're over time and I have to unfortunately get to my next meeting. Is this something that we could follow up on in the next meeting or in a GitHub tracker, Brad?
Let's do it next meeting. There's no rush on that since we're going for 15.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. I'm going to stop the stream.